I never thought I'd be typing this, but my wife just gambled away our house. We've been married for nearly 8 years. In all that time, I thought we had a pretty stable life. Nothing flashy, just the usual struggles, paying the bills, planning for the future, and keeping up with the everyday grind. But apparently that wasn't the full picture. There was something going on behind the scenes, something I hadn't seen coming. The first clue came in the form of an envelope. I was going through the usual pile of mail, mostly junk and a couple of bills, when I saw a letter with a return address from our mortgage lender. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe they'd made a mistake with the payment, or maybe it was just a routine notice. I opened it up, and my stomach dropped. It wasn't routine at all. The letter was a formal notice informing us that we were 3 months behind on our mortgage payments. 3 months? That couldn't be right. I checked our account, and sure enough, the last payment had gone through more than 90 days ago. I was confused. We had enough money in the account to cover it, or at least I thought we did. I immediately called the bank. The person on the other end of the line confirmed what I'd already seen. No payments had been made for the last 3 months. The confusion quickly turned into something darker. I knew I hadn't missed any payments, so I began to wonder if someone had tampered with the account. I hung up the phone, and that's when the full reality began to sink in. I started looking through the account history, and that's when I noticed it. Several large withdrawals over the past few months. They weren't for groceries or bills, and they definitely weren't for any big household expenses we'd discussed. The amounts ranged from a few hundred to a few $1,000s at a time, all disappearing in one go. The pattern was unmistakable. Something was draining our savings fast. The more I looked, the clearer it became. My wife had been quietly withdrawing money, but not for anything normal or necessary. It was going to online gambling sites, places I didn't even know she had access to. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. Maybe her account had been hacked, or maybe there was some kind of fraud going on. But as I kept digging, it became impossible to ignore the truth. The gambling transactions were all tied to her personal account. The missing money, the weird gaps in our savings, it was all pointing back to her. And the mortgage, that was just the tip of the iceberg. I confronted her that night. It wasn't the kind of screaming match you might expect. It started much quieter, with me laying out what I'd found. At first, she acted like she didn't know what I was talking about. She claimed it must be a mistake, some kind of error with the bank. But I wasn't buying it. I pressed her, showing her the withdrawals, the gambling sites. That's when her defenses started to crack. She admitted she'd been gambling, but she tried to downplay it like it wasn't a big deal. It's just a hobby, she said. Something to pass the time. She made it sound like she was spending a few bucks here and there for fun. But that didn't explain why our mortgage hadn't been paid, why our savings had been drained, or why there were thousands of dollars unaccounted for. As I kept pushing, she finally let more slip. It wasn't just a small habit. She'd been gambling online for months, hoping to win big and fix everything. She said it started small, but as time went on, she began betting more, convinced she could turn it around. But instead of winning, she kept losing, and every time she lost, she doubled down, hoping to make it back. That's how she gambled away the house. It was surreal, hearing her say those words out loud. She hadn't meant to, she said. She thought she could win enough to cover the mortgage, but instead, she dug us deeper into a hole. I didn't know what to say at first. My mind was racing, trying to process it all. How could she have kept this from me for so long? Why hadn't she told me when things started getting out of control? The more I thought about it, the more the little things started to make sense. Her staying up late, the unexplained absences, the times she seemed distant or preoccupied. It was all connected, and I hadn't seen it until it was too late. But that wasn't even the worst part. As we talked, she finally admitted something else. It wasn't just the house. There was more debt. A lot more. Credit cards, personal loans, even some payday loans I didn't know about. The numbers she threw out were staggering. Our entire financial situation was crumbling, and I hadn't realized it until it was too late. I asked her why she hadn't told me sooner, why she let it get this bad. Her response was vague, something about being afraid, about not wanting to disappoint me. But that didn't make it better. It didn't change the fact that we were now on the edge of financial ruin, all because she'd hidden this massive problem from me. We didn't resolve anything that night. She didn't offer any real solutions, just more excuses. I didn't know what to do, and honestly, I still don't. The damage is done, and now I'm left trying to figure out how to salvage what's left of our life. But as bad as things are, there's still this nagging feeling in the back of my mind that we're not even close to rock bottom yet. I've barely scratched the surface of what she's done, and I'm terrified of what else I might find. Because if she's willing to gamble away our house, what else has she been hiding? And that's the part that scares me the most. It's not just the house, it's everything. After that first night, when my wife admitted to gambling away the house, I knew I needed to dig deeper. Something told me this wasn't the full story. There had to be more. So the next morning, I sat down with my laptop and started going through everything, line by line. The mortgage issue had been bad enough, but it quickly became clear that our financial problems were far more extensive. Credit cards I didn't even know we had were maxed out. I'm talking balances in the tens of thousands. They weren't in just her name either. They were in both of ours. Loans I had never agreed to had been taken out in our names as well. Payday loans, personal loans, anything she could get her hands on. It was like staring into a black hole of debt, and it was swallowing everything. As I pieced through the transactions, I could see how it all happened. There were hundreds of small purchases, sometimes just $20, sometimes $100, on gambling apps and online casinos. It wasn't just one platform either. It was dozens. Then there were the bigger charges. $500 here, $1,000 there. She had been trying to win back the money she lost over and over again, but every time it just got worse. And now we were on the verge of losing everything. What really shook me was how far this had reached. I thought the mortgage was the biggest problem, but I was wrong. Our savings were completely gone, wiped out. The small cushion we had set aside for emergencies had been used up months ago. I hadn't even noticed because she had been moving money around, making it seem like everything was still fine. But it wasn't. It hadn't been for a long time. As I dug deeper, I realized we weren't just talking about our accounts. She had also borrowed money from her family, thousands of dollars. I found out when I called her brother, desperate for answers. He sounded awkward on the phone, like he'd been dreading this conversation. That's when he told me she'd borrowed money from him, her parents, and even a few of her friends. In total, it was more than I could have imagined, more than I knew how to deal with. Her family had no idea what she was using the money for. She told them it was for home repairs, medical bills, anything but the truth. But now that they knew what was really going on, they were furious. I couldn't blame them. As the day went on, I felt like everything was crashing down around me. Every plan we had for the future, buying a new car, saving for a vacation, putting aside money for emergencies, was now impossible. Our future was crumbling, and all I could do was watch. The weight of the financial ruin was becoming overwhelming, and I wasn't sure how we were going to get out of it. I tried talking to her again that night. I laid out everything I had found, the loans, the credit cards, the money she borrowed from family. She sat there, quiet, looking down at her hands. When she finally spoke, it was the same story as before. She didn't mean for it to get this bad. She thought she could fix it. She was just trying to win enough to make things right. But there was no making this right. We were in too deep. I told her we had to stop, that I was going to freeze the accounts, talk to a lawyer, and figure out how to salvage what was left of our financial lives. Her reaction was mixed. On one hand, she agreed. There was no denying how bad things had gotten. But on the other hand, she still seemed to think there was a way out, like one big win could somehow fix everything. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept racing, going over all the ways our life was falling apart. I started thinking about what would happen next. Would we have to sell everything? Would we lose the car, our savings, and any chance of retirement? How could I ever trust her again after this? The next morning, I called a lawyer. I didn't know much about this sort of thing, but I knew we needed professional help. Someone who could help us freeze accounts, protect what little we had left, and keep her from making things worse. The lawyer told me we could look into separating our finances legally, but it wouldn't be easy. We were so deeply tied together in debt that untangling everything could take months or even years. Still, it was a step I had to take. I also called the bank and froze our joint accounts. I was trying to stop the bleeding, but it felt like too little, too late. Every call I made, every piece of advice I received seemed to confirm what I already knew. We were in serious trouble, and there was no quick fix. But then, that night, things got even worse. When I came home, she wasn't there. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe she went out for groceries or just needed some space. But as the hours went by, I started to get worried. I called her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. I texted her, but no response. It wasn't like her to just disappear without saying something. By the next morning, I still hadn't heard from her. That's when I really started to panic. I had no idea where she was, what she was doing, or if she was safe. My mind immediately went to the worst-case scenario. Had she run off to gamble again? Was she trying to fix things on her own, making everything worse? I didn't know what to think. I tried calling her family, but they hadn't heard from her either. I was left sitting at home, staring at my phone, wondering where she was and what was going to happen next. The situation was spiraling out of control, and I had no idea how to stop it. She's back, and it's worse than I thought. After 2 agonizing days of silence, my wife walked through the front door like nothing had happened. She looked disheveled, dark circles under her eyes, but she didn't seem ashamed or apologetic, just exhausted. I stood there waiting for her to explain where she'd been, what she'd done. But instead, she walked right past me, heading to the bedroom without a word. I followed her, not sure if I was more relieved or furious. I was ready to ask her what was going on when I noticed something off. There were new charges on our joint account. I had frozen the credit cards, but somehow she had found a way to access funds I didn't even know we still had. She'd taken what little was left in our retirement account and used it. Every last cent. She'd been at it again, gambling, trying to fix what was broken by making it worse. I stood there, trying to comprehend the depth of this new disaster. She had cleaned out our retirement, leaving us with nothing. I didn't even know she had access to that account, but somehow she did, and now it was gone. It wasn't just the house anymore. Our future, what little safety net we had left, was gone. When I finally confronted her, she didn't argue or deny it this time. Instead, she just sat there, staring at the floor. She mumbled something about trying to fix everything, trying to win enough money to pay off the debts, but it didn't matter anymore. The damage was done. She hadn't fixed anything. She'd only dug the hole deeper. While we were in the middle of this, there was a knock on the door. I didn't expect anyone, but when I opened it, I came face to face with a man I'd never seen before. He handed me a stack of papers, a lawsuit. Debt collectors had caught up to us. They were coming for everything we had left, and if we couldn't pay, they would take whatever they could, our car, any personal belongings of value, anything to cover the losses. It felt like the walls were closing in. We were trapped. After he left, I felt the weight of everything crash down all at once. I couldn't even bring myself to look at her. We were bankrupt. We had nothing left, and this wasn't something that could be brushed under the rug anymore. It was real, and the consequences were closing in fast. The days after that visit were some of the hardest. We barely spoke. The tension in the house was unbearable. Every conversation we had turned into an argument. I wanted answers. How could she let it get this far? What was she thinking? But she never had anything helpful to say. She'd either retreat into silence or try to justify her actions by saying she was trying to fix things. The trust that had been hanging by a thread was now completely gone. I had no choice but to meet with the lawyer again. We were drowning, and I needed professional advice on what could be done to salvage whatever was left of our life. When I sat down with him, he laid out our options, which weren't many. Bankruptcy was one possibility, but even that wouldn't be an easy fix. Our assets would be liquidated, and we'd be left with nothing but the clothes on our backs. The lawyer also warned that her gambling addiction could complicate things even further. The creditors might not be willing to negotiate if they suspected fraud, or if they thought she'd continue digging us into a deeper hole. The reality of the situation started sinking in even more. We weren't just losing money, we were losing everything. Our home, our stability, our future. And now I had to seriously consider whether staying in this marriage was even an option anymore. Part of me felt like I should have left already, but it's not easy walking away from a life you've built together, even when that life is falling apart. At this point, the exhaustion was taking a toll on me. Every day felt like a new blow, a new crisis to manage. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about survival. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next bill, the next legal notice, the next reminder that our life was spiraling out of control. And through it all, she was still here, but she wasn't really present. We were living in the same house, but it felt like we were on opposite sides of a canyon. It wasn't long before I realized I couldn't handle this alone. I needed more than legal advice. I needed to protect myself. So I began preparing for the worst. I started putting things in place, talking to a separate lawyer, one who could help me figure out what my options were if I decided to leave. I knew I had to think about separating our finances, maybe even filing for divorce. It wasn't a decision I was ready to make yet, but it was one I had to prepare for. Then came the final straw. One afternoon, while I was at work, I got a call from the bank. It wasn't a routine call. It was a fraud alert. My heart sank as the representative on the line explained that someone had tried to open a new line of credit under my name. At that moment, I knew she wasn't going to stop. Even after everything, she was still looking for ways to gamble, still trying to chase that impossible win. It was the last piece of confirmation I needed. She was beyond saving, and if I didn't act fast, I would be dragged down with her. I came home that night, ready to take action. I had already spoken to the lawyer about freezing all remaining assets in my name, and I knew I had to make a choice. As much as I hated the idea, I couldn't continue living this nightmare. I had reached my breaking point, so I packed a bag. I wasn't sure if I was leaving for good, but I knew I needed space to think clearly. I didn't tell her where I was going. I just walked out the door, leaving her sitting at the kitchen table, staring at her phone. I wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, I was taking control of what little I had left. And just like that, I stepped out into the unknown with no idea what would happen next. I never thought it would come to this, but here we are, in court. After I walked out, I spent a few nights at my brother's place. He didn't ask too many questions, but it was clear he knew something serious was going on. I hadn't told my family much until then. The full extent of what was happening, the gambling, the debt, the bankruptcy looming, was something I had tried to keep private, but now it was too big to hide, and I needed support. The next few days were a whirlwind of phone calls and paperwork. I'd already spoken to the lawyer about separating our finances, but now I had to make it official. Divorce seemed like the only option left. It wasn't just the emotional toll, though that was plenty. It was the legal mess we were drowning in. Filing for bankruptcy was another step we couldn't avoid. I was doing everything I could to keep my head above water, but it felt like I was constantly one step behind, chasing solutions as new problems kept popping up. Court wasn't what I expected. I don't know what I thought it would be. Some dramatic confrontation, maybe. Instead, it was just a lot of legal jargon, numbers, and documents. The judge didn't care about the emotions behind it all. They just wanted the facts. We were broke. We had debts we couldn't pay. It was as simple as that, at least on paper. The reality, of course, was much messier. We had to split our remaining assets, which wasn't much by then. There wasn't a house to argue over anymore. The car was still in my name, so I kept that. The rest of it, whatever small savings we had left, personal items, was divided up in a way that made sense legally but felt hollow. We'd built a life together, and now we were tearing it apart, piece by piece, in front of strangers. The bankruptcy process was grueling. Every detail of our financial disaster had to be laid bare. I found myself going over every bank statement, every loan document, trying to figure out where it had all gone so wrong. There were meetings with debt collectors, legal mediators, all trying to hammer out some kind of deal that would keep them from taking everything. I quickly learned that they didn't care about our personal issues. They just wanted their money. My lawyer was trying to get as much of the debt wiped clean as possible through the bankruptcy filing, but it wasn't going to be that simple. Some of the loans she had taken out, particularly the payday loans, were proving harder to dismiss. They were tied up in all kinds of red tape, and the collectors were relentless. It was clear that even if we got some of the debt forgiven, I was still going to be responsible for a good chunk of it. That was the reality I had to face. In the middle of all this, I heard from her family. They were just as devastated as I was, maybe more so. They had no idea she had borrowed money from them under false pretenses. Her brother was furious, her parents were heartbroken, and they weren't sure how to move forward. They didn't blame me, but they were angry and hurt by the whole situation. It felt like there was no end to the people she had let down, and I couldn't help but wonder if she even fully understood the damage she had caused. But the real blow came about a week later. I was at the lawyer's office, going over the latest round of paperwork, when I got a phone call. It was from a fraud investigator. At first, I didn't understand what was happening, but as the conversation went on, the pieces started to come together. Apparently, my wife's gambling had taken a darker turn than I realized. She hadn't just been losing our money. She had been using other people's information, my information, her family's, even friends. She had taken out loans in their names without their knowledge, and now it had escalated into potential criminal charges. Fraud. That was the word they kept using. What had started as a gambling problem was now spiraling into something much bigger, and I was getting pulled into it. The investigator wanted to know if I had any knowledge of it, if I had been involved. I was furious. How could they even think that? But I also knew that legally, things weren't always so clear-cut. We had shared accounts, joint finances. I could be implicated in ways I hadn't even considered. I immediately called my lawyer. He told me that I wasn't the first person to be caught in a mess like this, but that didn't make me feel any better. The fraud charges could lead to an entirely new set of legal problems, and if the creditors or authorities decided to come after us, I could be facing consequences for her actions. It was a nightmare scenario, one I hadn't even imagined when all of this started. I knew she had a problem, but I never thought it would escalate to this level. And now, not only was our financial future destroyed, but our reputations were on the line too. If it went to court, if the fraud charges stuck, who knew what could happen? I was terrified of what might come next. The distance between us was now more than just emotional. It was legal, financial, and personal. I was doing everything I could to protect myself, but it felt like the ground was constantly shifting beneath my feet. Every time I thought I had a handle on the situation, something new would come crashing down. By the end of that week, I knew one thing for sure. There was no going back. The woman I had married was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize, someone willing to drag everyone down with her, even when the consequences were staring her in the face. And with that realization came a bitter truth. I had to cut all ties, no matter how hard it would be. Because if I didn't, I wasn't just risking my financial stability, I was risking everything. The next step was clear. I had to finalize the divorce, separate myself legally and financially, and brace myself for whatever came next. Because with her, it seemed like there was always another surprise waiting just around the corner. It's over, but it feels like I've lost everything. The legal battle finally came to a close after months of back and forth with lawyers, debt collectors, and the courts. We were officially divorced, and the bankruptcy was finalized. It felt like the end of a long, drawn-out nightmare, but instead of relief, there was just this heavy emptiness. In a way, it felt like losing everything all over again. Our assets had been liquidated, what little we had left anyway. The house was gone, sold to pay off a fraction of the debt. The car, which I had fought to keep, was spared, but the rest of it was gone. My retirement savings? Drained. The joint accounts we once shared were now a memory, and I was left starting from scratch, financially ruined. The debt collectors got what they could, but the reality is, they'll never get everything back. We were too deep in the hole for that. Once the divorce was official, I found myself looking for a new place to live. I couldn't stay in that house, even if I could have somehow managed to keep it. It was full of too many bad memories, too much tension. I found a small apartment across town, nothing fancy, just a place to start over. Moving in felt like a fresh start, but also like stepping into the unknown. I was on my own now, and the safety net I thought I'd had was gone. My wife, or my ex-wife now, wasn't much of a presence in my life after the divorce. From what I heard through mutual contacts, she was finally getting help. Her family had staged an intervention, and she agreed to go to therapy and rehab for her gambling addiction. I hope it works for her. I really do. But at this point, I can't be part of her recovery. It's too late for that, at least for me. I hadn't spoken to her since the court finalized everything. There were no tearful goodbyes, no closure conversations, just a clean break. I knew that was for the best, but sometimes it still didn't feel real. 8 years of marriage, and it ended in silence and a mountain of debt. In the weeks following the resolution, I started to realize just how much damage had been done, not just to my finances, but to my sense of security. I used to feel like I had a handle on life, like I could plan for the future with confidence. But now, every decision I made was weighed down by the fear of making another mistake, of trusting someone too much or overlooking signs that should have been obvious. I tried to pick up the pieces and rebuild. It's strange starting over in your 30s, watching your friends and coworkers talk about their vacations, their growing families, their new homes, while I was trying to figure out how to stay afloat on a salary that once seemed comfortable. I kept to myself more, partly out of shame and partly because I didn't know how to explain what had happened. Most people knew about the divorce in vague terms, but few knew the full extent of the financial disaster behind it. Work became my main focus. I threw myself into my job, trying to regain some stability. I opened a new savings account, though it was nowhere near what I'd need for retirement. I started budgeting more carefully, tracking every dollar, trying to claw my way back from the brink of financial ruin. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Even though the legal battles were over, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more I didn't know. Part of me wondered if my ex-wife had been hiding even bigger secrets. I had heard rumors, whispers about other debts, about loans she might have taken out from people who didn't go through the courts, but I couldn't confirm anything, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. I had cut ties with her for a reason. Digging deeper wouldn't do me any good. Still, there was always that lingering worry that something else might surface. I kept expecting another letter, another debt I didn't know about, another mess to clean up. But as time passed, things stayed quiet. Maybe, just maybe, the worst was finally behind me. I started seeing a therapist, someone to talk to about the wreckage left behind. Not so much to deal with the emotional fallout of the divorce, though that was part of it, but more to figure out how to trust again, how to move forward without carrying the fear of being blindsided again. It was a slow process, but it helped. Little by little, I started to feel like I could rebuild a life for myself, even if it wasn't the life I had imagined. I wish I could say that I've fully moved on, that everything is back to normal. But the truth is, the damage is long-lasting. Financially, I'm still working to rebuild, and I don't know when I'll ever feel truly secure again. Emotionally, it's a different kind of recovery. I'm cautious, maybe too cautious, about letting people in. I don't know when or if I'll be ready to trust someone that way again, but I'm trying. I've learned to appreciate the small victories, paying off a bill, putting a little extra into savings, finding moments of peace in my new apartment. It's not the life I had planned, but it's the life I had planned, but it's the life I'm living now, and I'm learning to be okay with that. As for her, I don't know where she'll end up. Maybe rehab will work, and she'll get her life back on track. Maybe she'll keep slipping. I can't control that anymore, and I've accepted that. I had to. The only life I can control now is mine, and that's more than enough to focus on. I'm not sure if I'll ever fully recover from what happened, but I'm moving forward, step by step. It's a new chapter, one I didn't expect, but it's mine to write. The damage has been done, and I'm still picking up the pieces. But with each day, the pieces start to fit together just a little bit more.